You see here 3 gauge swatches works in exactly the same stitch count, so they all have the same number of stitches and have the same number of rows, yet they're not the same size. You can see here that they're clearly different heights. They are the same width, but not the same height. And this has to do with the way you make your stitches. And it specifically refers to your first loop on your hook, the golden loop. I'll show you how to adjust for these kind of differences. And this is significant when you're working to size, because you can change your hook size to compensate for width, but you're not going to adjust for height by changing your hook size. You need to change the way you work your stitches to correct for this difference. So I'll show you how to compensate for this by making your stitches in just a slightly different way. So how to adjust for your stitch size. I have here a little test piece, so this is just to show you how to compensate for that golden loop. If you're making a stitch, any stitch, let's say you're doing a half treble, you yarn over and you insert into the stitch, you pick up a loop, and then you yarn over and you take off. Now the golden loop, the loop that's determining the height of your stitches, is this first loop on your hook here. It's this loop. And depending on what you do with this first loop, your stitches become taller or shorter. We all have a certain natural way of doing this. And some people tend to really pull back on this yarn, some people call them yankers, that you really yank this yarn back. You can see if I'm doing that, how small this loop is becoming. And because I'm having a lot of tension on this yarn, if I now yarn over and pull through, my stitch is becoming reasonably short. So I'll show you again. I'm making this stitch, and now as I open up, I pull back on this yarn, and I'm making my stitch shorter if I yarn over and make the stitch. Other people, they yarn over and they keep their hook very much on the level of their work. For example, you could also work more in this direction or more in this direction. If you keep your hook reasonably on top of your work, you're so-called riding your work, and then your stitches tend to be just a little bit taller. So if you do it like this, the stitches are just a little taller than they are for a yanker. You can see how this loop is just a little bit higher. But then there are people, so-called lifters. Let me yarn over and make a stitch. And what they do is they lift up this loop and now make the stitch. And then this stitch is considerably higher than that stitch, and especially a lot higher than those yanker stitches we had at the beginning. So I've got these 3 stitches here, and this one is shorter in the middle and the longest. So if I yarn over and make a lifter stitch, and a lifter stitch can be, some people lift it really high, like really up to here, and then make a stitch. And you can see how that stitch is really considerably much longer than this stitch. And we all have a natural way of making our stitches. And as such, there's nothing wrong with the way you make this stitch. But if you're trying to work to gauge, the way you deal with the height of this stitch really determines the gauge of your final piece. So if you have a tendency to, for example, pull a lot on this thread, your stitches are going to be shorter. And if you have a tendency to lift your loop, it's going to be much longer. And by changing the way you make those stitches and the way you work with that first loop, you can change the gauge on your piece. So making it higher or shorter, making your stitches higher or shorter. So I'll just show you again. If your stitches are too high, it means you're most probably doing this. You're lifting your stitch up. Try to do that just a little less. If your stitches are too short, you must probably pulling this loop tight. Don't do that. Just let the yarn go just a little bit. And maybe you are a rider and your loops are really down here. Maybe that's good in this case, maybe not. Depends on your personal way of making the rest of your stitches. But give yourself a bit more room or a bit less room depending on how it's going. My natural way of working, I'm somewhere between a rider and a lifter. That's my you see when I make my stitches, if I don't do anything, I'm not exactly on my work, but I'm not exactly high either. I'm kind of a little bit in between here. And I found that works well with most designs for gauge. So, but especially if you're a lifter and you go really high like this, you're almost probably going to have to adapt your stitches and make them just a little shorter. You see how high these stitches are compared to the others. You see these two again are much higher than what's happening here at the beginning of the row. So consistency is what you're going for, and also adapt for the correct stitch height by paying attention to the way that you deal with this first loop on your hook. And this is for all stitches you're making, whether it's a double crochet or a treble or a double treble. This loop is always the one that's going to determine how high your stitches are. So deal with this loop and adjust if needed, especially if your swatches are the correct width but they're not the correct height. This is the way to adjust for that.